presumptive waste. If you take your handout and go about after that red slip sheet, if you go, and I wish I had numbers on these pages and I don't, for that I apologize, about 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 18 pages into your handout after the red slip sheet, there's a list of chemicals starting with acetaldehyde and acetic acid, acetone, cyanohydrin, acetonitrile, goes so on and so on. These are all chemicals that are specifically listed. And if those chemicals are included in my waste stream, then it's considered a hazardous waste in the state of California. It's a guideline. At any level, to be decided. I'll come back to that. The page before that, on the top of the page, it lists toxic, corrosive, ignitable, and it lists reactive. These are common names. And these are common names of wastes that we've determined, our infinite wisdom, back in the 70s, that when you produce this waste stream, it generally, usually, almost always exhibits a hazardous waste characteristic. It's a hazardous waste. It's a presumptive list. It's presumed hazardous. It's our presumption based on our knowledge in the industry as a whole. When it's produced, it's hazardous. It's not always hazardous. It's almost always hazardous. Or sometimes it is always hazardous. Depends on what waste stream. This is the common name of those wastes. And if you look on the slide here, it says it's a common name, and why it's presumed hazardous is listed in the codes for X, C, I, and R. And so if you look at acetylene sludge is sludge of acetylene that's considered to be Exhibit A corrosive characteristic. That's why it's listed. That's why it's listed. So if it's not corrosive, is it not then a hazardous waste in the state of California? And the answer is not necessarily. You really have to look at all the characteristics. Even though it's listed for being corrosive and it doesn't exhibit a corrosive characteristic, you still have to make certain it doesn't exhibit any other characteristic. And if it exhibits no other characteristic, then it's not a hazardous waste according to the California criteria. And so if you look down the list, battery acid is considered to be corrosive. Bunker oil is considered to be both toxic and ignitable. Caustic wastewater is corrosive. My favorite, toxic chemical toilet waste. Okay, it's considered to be toxic. Question? No, it's not. This is not a listed waste. This is a presumptive waste. This is not a listed waste. These wastes are not listed. These are presumed. Because a listed waste is that, in that, if it's listed and you produce it, you're captured. A presumptive waste, you produce it. And it's listed on this presumptive list. It's a presumptive waste. Not necessarily a hazardous waste. Most likely it's a hazardous waste. And there's probably more of a regulatory burden placed on me, the generator, to try to look at and defend my practice why it's not. So I'm probably more likely to be questioned or challenged or be able to defend my practice if challenged from an enforcement officer, because likelihood it's a hazardous waste. And if it's on this list and you're not managing it as a hazardous waste, what proof, what verification, what characteristic, what testing have you done to pull it off this list? Yeah, this list appears in Title 22. Yeah, it's a presumptive list. So you know what I just said? Well, let me get to the other half of this, and then I'll tell you what I just said. So this list is presumed. Okay? It's presumed. Not that it is, not that it's not. Likely it is, not all the time. It's presumed. All right? Flip the page. You now have, you ready? There is a listing of 791 chemicals on the next 10, 12 pages. And it's not 791 chemicals, although it goes to zirconium picromate, which is 791, 6 numbers are aborted. So there's actually 785 chemicals. 785 chemicals that are presumed hazardous. Okay? Now, how many chemicals used in the United States? How many chemicals used in California? Anyone know? 10,000. Let's guess. That's actually a pretty good guess. Any other guesses? Come on, take a guess. I don't have a clue. I don't know. There was a study done by USC. It was about 21 years ago. 21 years ago. 1.8 million. So I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you if it's 2 million or 1.5 million. It's a lot. Check this out. I can now tell you definitively there's 791, less 6, where the state said if you produce a waste that includes this chemical, likely it's hazardous. It's the presumptive list that's chemical specific, whereas that first list we were looking at is a common name. Go get the lab waste. That's a common name. Look it up. There it is. It's presumed to be hazardous. Not that it is, but it's presumed. And it's likely it will be. State, federal, or both. If any of these chemicals is in the waste, it's presumed to be hazardous. Chances are it probably is if it's in high enough concentration, but not necessarily if it's not. Why are these chemicals listed? Well, this list serves 2 purposes. One, if there's an asterisk that appears next to the chemical name, that chemical is considered to be extremely hazardous. So the cost of managing it, how much you produce, how you dispose of it, where it's disposed of, goes up exponentially when you pay your fees and taxes to the Board of Equalization. Okay, that's this list of chemical names. So the extremely hazardous wastes in California appear with an asterisk. And here's the chemicals that are considered to be extremely hazardous waste. Number 1. Number 2, the regulatory burden placed on me, the generator, or my colleague, who's a generator, goes up exponentially if I take a waste that I produce that's listed by common name or listed by chemical component, I produce it, my colleague produces it, then the regulatory burden, why it's not hazardous, is then greater to be able to prove or substantiate, if challenged by enforcement, CUPA, DTSC, that it's not. So I'm more likely to be challenged. So if I take my oil or my used paint, the oil's a bad example. That's actually in the Health and Safety Code. If I take my paint, and that's not a good example because there's an exemption for latex paint, but if I take something and I decide to throw it away and put it in the garbage, and it's not hazardous, I'm more likely to be challenged. Why is it not hazardous? Can you prove that this is not a hazardous waste? And the regulatory burden for accomplishing that goes up if one of these chemicals are present or one of those common names of wastes is produced and managed and otherwise disposed of. You ready? Ready? This list means nothing. Did you figure that out? That's what it means. There it is. Good luck. Because, ready? If I have a waste not on the list, but it exhibits a characteristic, you name it, corrosive, ignitable, reactive, or toxic, it's hazardous waste. If I have a waste that I produce that's a solid waste federally, or I relinquish it, California, I get rid of it, and it's on the list, but it doesn't exhibit any characteristic, that it's not a hazardous waste. This is a go-by. It's a guideline. That's all it is. That's all it is. Nothing here definitive. Clear as mud? We're good? Yeah, question. Right. That's yeah, actually, you brought up a candidate that's a great candidate for a designated waste. Yeah, not a hazardous waste. And if it's not a hazardous waste, it's not subject to DOT. Because we adopted the DOT requirements from the Hazardous Materials Transportation Safety Act for defining a hazardous waste for asbestos. So 1% friable regulated by DOT, hazardous waste. Not 1%, or it is, but it's not friable. And the definition of friability is the same for DOT as it is for hazardous waste. They're the same. So, but I can't necessarily take it to a landfill and have it disposed of, because there may be permit restrictions, or they may have just a general liability clause that says we're just not going to deal with it or handle it. Yeah, yeah. So not a hazardous waste, not non-RCRA, but we still may have a disposal issue in terms of where it goes for disposal. Okay, we're good? You know what I just did? I just spent probably 10 minutes talking about a list. Doesn't mean anything. But you understand how it works, right? Okay. All right, so where we generally find wastes that are subject to being hazardous, excluding the listed wastes that I'll talk about later on after the break, is a waste generally is captured because it exhibits a characteristic. A characteristic is one of those 4 characteristics. California's characteristics are the same as the federal, but they're defined differently. So they're not exactly the same. They're similar in terms of what we say corrosive is, but in terms of toxic waste, big differences. In terms of corrosive wastes, some differences. But in terms of ignitable or reactive waste, they are the same. There is no difference. So these are our 4 characteristics. Ignitable, corrosive, reactive, and toxic. Federally, if it meets the federal definition, which I will define for you here momentarily, we give it a characteristic code. It's a D code. D01, D02, D03 are toxic wastes where wastes fail or they're presumed to fail the TCLP regulatory threshold for a chemical component. Then those have numbers D004 through D043. So, in our infinite wisdom in the United States, we now have, you ready? A list of 40 chemicals. Now, how many chemicals do we use in the United States over the course of a year? Does anybody know? Anybody swag? Just take a guess. How many chemicals are used in the United States? 10 million. Okay, that's probably a pretty good guess. Yeah, I don't have a clue. CDC released a report about 4 years ago. It was between 4 to 6. Now that was 4 to 6 years ago, so who knows? A lot. We have identified 40 chemicals federally. And if you relinquish, you have a spent waste, get rid of it, send it off-site, we have a toxicity criteria regulatory threshold for 40 chemicals. So there is a boat full of waste we produce federally in California that are not going to be captured federally because it's a very small finite list. It's very small. It's 40 chemicals. Of the millions of chemicals used, it's 40. Okay, so we have the characteristics. I'm going to talk about those momentarily. And then testing or applying knowledge. Do I have to test my waste? No. No, there's no regulatory requirement in the state of California nor federally that require a generator to test our waste. Sure. Okay, all right. Federally, yeah. Welcome to California. Because that highly toxic chemical that you produce in California is likely to get captured not because of our wet test, because we have these lists of chemicals. Ready? About 38 to 40 chemicals. Almost the same list. But when it's all said and done, we have carcinogenic compounds. There's 23 listed in Title 22 that don't exist federally. And it may be one of those carcinogens or salts or derivatives. Or more likely, it's going to fail the fish brow assay. So when I put stickleback or fathead minnows or rainbow trout in a fish tank and wait 96 hours, 4 days, with that highly toxic chemical you just talked about in that fish tank, what's going to happen is 5 or more of those fish are going to go belly up. So it's a game over. It's a hazardous waste. So it'll be captured in California, and you can't just throw it away. No. But if I lived in Nevada, yes, potentially. Yeah. Yeah. In Nevada, I don't know about Nevada. I know Arizona has certain guidelines for, Nevada regulates special wastes, which are similar to our designated waste. So Nevada does have some waste that they regulate beyond RCRA, but not a lot. Not a lot. Not like California. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. All right. So, no, there's no state or federal requirement that requires us to test our waste. Okay. So I can produce, make a widget, produce a compound, epoxy resin, paint, use it for automotive maintenance, produce this waste that I'm going to use, recycle, reclaim, or get rid of, and that waste doesn't require me to test it. So who requires us to test our waste? Yeah, the permit requirement for the ultimate facility that's going to manage it is probably going to impose greater requirements in terms of how the waste is tested than I am. And they're bound by a permit, number one. Number two, they're also bound by the regulatory community. So when they come out by either DTSC, state permit, DTSC, US EPA, federal permit, and their facility is inspected, they're at risk of having a non-compliant item found if they don't subscribe to what's mandated in their permit. So a lot of what they require to protect themselves from a liability is, it's aqueous, I got a pH of 2, you're going to send it to me, they're going to be looking for I have an aqueous waste, has a low pH, I'm going to have the generator check for, no, I know it's corrosive, okay, it has a pH of 1, okay, so I know it's corrosive. And it's aqueous, it's water, it contains water. They're going to have me check, the world check for metals. Yeah. Yep. And I want a lab result of that waste to verify, confirm, validate that it does or doesn't have metals. Because if it does have metals, it's a whole different game. If it's corrosive, the characteristic code for being corrosive is one thing, but the treatment standards that are imposed on metals, we're all over the board, right? Because we have lots of treatment standards, lots of LDRs. We have state metals, we got federal metals. But once a federal metal is present above the regulatory threshold for being a hazardous waste federally, then it's captured by RCRA, and how that gets treated is subject to the federal requirements. So the cost of managing that goes up exponentially. But the receiving facility is going to be the one that imposes a standard on me. Hey, we want an analytical result of the metals. Plus, we're required to have knowledge of our waste. I'm not certain what's there. It was abandoned. I found it. Oh, okay. Better test it. Because if you get rid of it and it's not right, we're liable to know the difference. Because we're the producer, we're the generator. Okay. Oh, one other comment. The waste may be listed or characteristic. I'm going to probably get through the characteristic criteria. We'll take a break, come back. We'll talk about the listed criteria. A waste can be both listed and it can also exhibit a characteristic. So it really doesn't matter a whole lot because once it becomes captured, it's game over. Once it's captured. Once I capture it as a hazardous waste, now we have to decide state or federal. But it's captured, it's managed, we have to manage it as a hazardous waste. All right, so, you ready? Go back to that imprint. Go back to that slide that showed RCRA on one side and non-RCRA on the other. And what I'm about to do is talk about the characteristics of what makes a waste a hazardous waste. And I'm going to talk about the state and the federal program simultaneously. Because for us, if it's captured, it's a hazardous waste. And if it's a federal hazardous waste, we assign a RCRA number to it. And it turns out that for an ignitable waste that exhibits an ignitable characteristic, the definition is the same. There is no difference. So if it's captured by RCRA, we capture it in the state. And it's a RCRA hazardous waste. It's both. We manage it as a RCRA hazardous waste. We can assign a state waste code and a federal waste code to that waste stream. And if it's used in a closed-cup Penske test methodology where the flash point is at or below 140 degrees Fahrenheit, 60 degrees Celsius, hazardous waste. Okay, a liquid. Flash points. Liquids have flash points. What's a liquid? What's a liquid? Not a solid. And you're right. That's a liquid. What's a solid? Go ahead, somebody say it. Not a liquid. You're right. I have grease. Liquid, solid. Liquid. At what temperature? Yeah. This is a fairly smart class. Okay, ready? 1 atmosphere, 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Take a 5 cc representative sample of the waste, put it in a 70 micron mesh paint filter conical shaped funnel, wait 5 minutes, 1 atmosphere, 78 degrees, does it drip? Yeah, that's a liquid. What's in the filter is a solid. And your waste is a sludge, maybe both. But to check for flash point, it's got to be liquid. Because flash point is dependent upon the liquid. And if that liquid has a flash point at or below 140 degrees, using a closed-cup Penske-Martin's test methodology, it's a hazardous waste. If you intend to relinquish it, dispose of it, recycle it, dispose of it. Want to get shape? Or, ready? It's a solid. And if it's ignited by friction, absorption of moisture, or undergoes spontaneous chemical change and burns vigorously and persistently, that's also ignitable waste. So, friction, red phosphorus. Red phosphorus, flammable solid. It's used with an amalgam on a striking plate of matches and flares at about 40 to 60%. And you take an object across the striking plate, it ignites. So red phosphorus is a solid, it's ignitable. It's D001. It's not a liquid, doesn't have a flash point, but it's an ignitable waste. Absorption of moisture or undergoes spontaneous chemical change. Okay, absorption of moisture. Calcium carbide. Calcium carbide, it's a solid. It will absorb moisture, it's hygroscopic, and when it does that, it forms, ready, acetylene gas. So that's an ignitable waste. It's not a liquid, but it's an ignitable waste. Or spontaneous chemical change. A lot of your organic peroxides are typically temperature dependent. They're typically handled, refrigerated, mostly frozen. If they reach room temperature, they will generally spontaneously ignite or explode from the container. So organic peroxides, hazard class 5.2, calcium carbide, which is a flammable solid, dangerous when wet, red phosphorus, which is a flammable solid, 4.1, where calcium carbide is 4.3. My point here is it doesn't have to be a liquid. It could be a solid. Or, ready? It's an ignitable compressed gas or it's an oxidizer. So it could be actually an oxidizer, could be a liquid or a solid, and then a compressed gas. So it could be a gas, liquid, solid, or an oxidizer, which could be any physical state. And if I go to dispose of it, it's D001. It's considered ignitable. The reason why oxidizers are listed is oxidizers are self-evolving chemicals that produce oxygen when they react. So when you produce oxygen when it reacts, it facilitates and supports combustion. And that definition of an ignitable waste is the same for the state of California, non-RCRA, as it is federally for RCRA. And if I produce a waste, it's a hazardous waste. Questions? Any questions? Okay, great question. If I have a sludge, and I'm going to separate the liquid phase from the solid phase from the sludge, and I'm going to manage them separately, and I'm going to decant the liquid from the solid sludge. And I'm not going to use a centrifuge. I use gravity settling treatment, and I decant the liquid. then I can manage that separately and classify and characterize those as two separate waste streams. Unless it came from a listed source. If it was listed, it's captured, game over. But you could do that. You could do that. In a lot of instances, when people find out, determine, check for whether or not a waste is a characteristic waste, for dealing with flashpoints, a liquid. It has to be a liquid to be an ignitable waste. I have a 5-gallon drum of gasoline I use for my lawnmower, and I spill it hypothetically on my property. And I scoop up the soil and I put it in a drum. Unless it meets that second definition, it doesn't meet the first one, it's not an ignitable waste. It may be toxic. It may be toxic to fish. It may be a non-recra. But it was a liquid when I spilled it, but now it's a solid. So I can't determine that to be a flammable waste or an ignitable waste based on the flashpoint because I have no liquid. Yeah. So that was kind of my point. Good question. Any other questions? Yep. A solid answer? You want a solid answer? Solid answer. You want a solid answer. You really want a solid answer? What planet did you fall from? Okay. Excluding the federal RECRA de minimis rule, okay, which says we don't care about it. Okay, you with me? And it doesn't really apply because we have our own criteria in California. Is your rags saturated? You said it was IPA? IPA? 99% IPA? Okay. And how saturated are the rags? Very. Varies or varied? It varies. Okay. Okay. So that rag that varies in its saturation that you produce, bench lab, bench scale, cleanup operation, wiping equipment, degreasing, whatever the case is. Okay. If it's not listed, assuming that it's not listed, and I don't think IPA is an F-listed solvent. I have to check. I don't think so. No. Okay. So, and you put it in a receptacle after you've used it. That receptacle you put it in, that wipe, you're going to dispose of, or you're going to take the wipe and you're going to have them cleaned, reconditioned, and reused. Disposed of. Okay. And the wipe that's put in the receptacle is partially saturated. Okay. So, is the receptacle airtight? So it's not airtight. Oh, it is airtight. It's not airtight. Okay. Okay. Is the facility a large quantity generator subject to RECRA CC requirements for VOCs above 500 parts per million? Probably not. So is it a large quantity generator? It is a large quantity generator? And it is subject to subtitle CC VOC requirements above 500 fugitive emissions. So that has to be. I'm sorry? If it's a large quantity generator, is the container greater than or less than 42 gallons that you put it in? Okay, so let's go 5 gallons. Is it closed according to the manufacturer's instructions? It is. It is. No, you described a container manufactured for a lab with the flip top. Subtitle CC describes instructions for DOT containers that have to be closed prior to transportation. So you're using a container for a facility. Subtitle CC requirements for VOCs above 500 fugitive emissions applies to large quantity generators using DOT spec containers. Otherwise, they have to have a system to scrub and accept the VOCs prior to discharging the outside ambient air. So we're twisted up in our underwear, and I haven't answered the question yet, right? You with me? Okay. The reason why I'm asking about the container is what's the condition of the rags before you actually, or when you offer them for off-site shipment? Saturated still? You know why they're not, don't you? Oh, okay. So let me see. Let's define treatment. Not that this is a class in treatment, but it's hazardous waste. So has the chemical characteristics of the waste changed while you've accumulated them? Oh, so do you have a tiered permit? Hypothetically, no. You know what? And this is why when I'm 65 fishing on my property in the northern part of the state with nobody out there, I won't think a thing of it. So in all fairness, if they're saturated, then to manage them as a potentially ignitable waste, they would have to really be saturated. Not where it's maybe dripping, maybe it is dripping, but what happens is you're looking at a waste that's being produced that is changing its chemical compositions, you're engaged in treatment, not probably permitted under the tiered permit process, and the characteristics that are exhibited by the waste when you package it are different than when you actually accumulated it. So I can give you any answer you want, and I can defend it. I have successfully with CUPAs. Here's the point. Here's the point. Use a rag that you launder. Game over. As long as the rag, when you ship it for laundering, doesn't exhibit any hazardous waste characteristics. And then you know what? It's like a shop rag. That I can defend easiest. Yeah. So where was I? Sir. I'm sorry, I'm... Yeah. Okay. Subpart CC is more, you'd have to look at, do you have 500 parts per million of fugitive emissions? Yes or no? Okay. Oh, off the radar. Okay. No, I didn't say that. I'm saying that you're using a rag. You're using a rag that's equipment. Like, what's that rag that we use that there's that exemption that applies? Remember that rag? It's called a shop towel. And there's a shop towel exemption. Not a lab rag, but there's a shop towel. It's like your coveralls. I'm a mechanic. I change oil and antifreeze and lubricants, and I get oil on my uniform, and then I launder it, right? And then I get it back and put it back on and use it again. And then I launder it, and then I get, you with me here? Okay. That rag that this young lady was talking about is going to be managed no differently. And in a court of law with my peers, I would be able to successfully defend that practice because as long as that rag that I'm using, that facility, is going to be reclaimed and cleaned and sent back like my clothing. And my point to this was what? Launder it. Yeah, it's called waste minimization. Great idea. Yeah. Okay, and you know what? Only about 95% don't. They throw it in the garbage, the receptacle. And that was the question. I avoided answering it because she wanted a definitive answer. I didn't give her. I think I sufficed her, and now you're forcing me to say something. Is that right? Is that right? You want me to say something. And to be honest with you, you probably have certain people in the regulatory community. You have certain people that are regulated in this room that is going to take Jerry said, and I get this every year. You want me to do what Jerry said, huh? Yeah. Yeah. The problem I've seen historically on this particular issue is that it's treatment. You're engaged in treatment. Not deliberately, but you are. You're treating the waste. You're changing the chemical composition of the waste. No. Container's closed and it's open, it's closed and it's open, it's closed. And then over time, unless it's sealed, like DOT requires it to be airtight, this container's closed, not sealed. This container's closed and sealed. But if it's open and closed to atmospheric pressure on and off periodically, those VOCs are going to, they're going to off-gas. They're going to evaporate. And so you're changing the chemical composition. So if I have a great working relationship with my CUPA, and I have my CUPA inspector is dating my son, it's all hypothetical, right? Not that it's ever happened. Then I go, hey, you know what? Ask her over tonight. I want to ask her a question. Of course, I might want it in writing, and you know what? You will get different answers. Anywhere from it is treatment, it's incidental, to, hey, you're changing the composition, it is treatment, you need to permit. That probably won't happen likely. To keep the container closed and airtight, to put it in the receptacle and twist the bag inside the receptacle so it is airtight every time you open and close it, but you still take the twisty off when you put another one in. So, yeah. Hey, you know what? Check this out. As long as you don't take the rag saturated and throw it in the garbage, whatever you do probably is fairly defensible. The question is it a hazardous waste? Yeah, no. By the time what I've experienced in my 28 years, no, it's not. Was it hazardous waste when you put it in a receptacle? You know what? Most of the times it's not either. Most of the times it's not either. Is there occasions? Yeah, there's occasions. So, but isopropyl alcohol is miscible in water. It's water soluble. So, if you took a representative sample of that rag, using SW846, the 96-hour fish bioassay, put it in a fish tank, you know what's going to happen to those fish? Nothing. Yeah. Oh, but this facility uses acetone. And this facility is thinking about the acetonitrile, and they're going to go back and say, hey, throw our rags away. Jerry said we could. I'm not saying that. There was a question. Yeah. Yep. Nope. Absolutely not. But there is instances where the rag, when it is saturated, actually is. That's at 5 or 10% of the time. Then what? Well, then. Because it would kill the fish. Kill the fish. Yeah. Kill the fish. And then we had acetonitrile over here, and MEK, and okay, you answer your own question. Would it be a D001? Yeah, and why? And why? And why? What makes it ignitable? Because what? Acetone is it's not that it's listed, but acetone is listed, but it's not that it's listed. Why is that ignitable? Why would that be a hazardous waste? The flashpoint, because wait a minute. We have to have a drip. We have to be liquid, right? Saturated is not a liquid. But if it's saturated and it's dripping, you take a representative sample defined in SW846, put it in a conical shaped 70 micron mesh paint filter, 5 cc's of the rag shredded, 78 degrees, 5 minutes. Is there a drip? My personal thought is probably not, but you might. If there is, yes, D001. Yep. You put it in the receptacle, and you go to dispose of it. There's no liquids in there. There's no liquids in there. It's not D001. And you know how many rags go out as D001 as an ignitable waste? They're not. They're not. Oh, so you're treating hazardous waste. You're evaporating hazardous. Oh. No, it's waste minimization. You're evaporating it so it's no longer ignitable. Okay? Here, if I'm going to do that, I'm going to send it out, and I'm a contractor, and I use D001, I'm going to tell my client, hey, it's this. It's solid, and yada, yada, yada. Doesn't really fit well. It's subjective, but that's the only way it would fit. Calcium carbide, yep. Red phosphorus, yep. A saturated rag, let me see. Solid ignited by friction. Yeah, if it's pretty saturated, but then I better be storing it in an airtight container because of the VOCs. And if I'm a large quantity generator because of CC, it probably needs to be an airtight container because it's in a 55-gallon drum that's not being scrubbed. But I can keep it in a process to recover those vapors if the container's not being scrubbed, where it's a flip-top UL-listed container that doesn't have to be airtight, but it's enclosed. And then I got to be thinking about if it's truly hazardous when it goes in there, that's probably treatment. And I'd want to have my CUPA concur. Yeah, it's probably treatment, but we probably don't evaporate stuff. And there's exceptions for evaporation, but that's for aqueous waste, not organics. Okay, we are so far off the beaten path. Okay, we're okay on ignitable? We're good?